question. There is a really big question that I know each one of us has asked at one point or another in our lives. And that question is, which person am I? Take me, for example. Am I a person who is unbound, standing, walking, driving, going to work, traveling, and just generally living a life in the best way available to her? Or am I another one? One who is disabled, dependent, mildly helpless, and kind of odd-looking, moving about the world in such a strange way by rolling and sitting. Well, it goes like this. If I go by my heart, if I go by how I feel, and by how I live my life, which includes going to work, driving my very own superhero-style modified van, traveling, enjoying time with friends and with loved ones, then I am the former. If I go by the mirror, if I go by what society tells me is normal and expected, then I am the latter. And that is true for all of us. We will either rise to what we know to be true for ourselves, or we will fall to what society and other people have decided is true for us. When it comes to me, I say that I stand a lot. And sometimes I get the feeling that I should not say that I stand. Like it is wrong somehow to use words that don't apply to you. And the word stand doesn't really apply to me. It wouldn't appear to. I will say things like, well, I was standing by the photocopier, or I walked to get a coffee. So I am basically lying. And it's not a lie exactly, but it feels like an untruth somehow, because stand does not really apply to me at all. I don't stand really, as I've said. I do sometimes, but hardly ever, and mostly never without assistance. I sit a lot, an inordinate amount of time, actually. I sit and I roll. So instead of saying, I walked to get a coffee, I should say, I rolled to get a coffee. Instead of saying, I was standing near the photocopier, I suppose I should say, I was sitting near the photocopier. Always sitting. But that feels like a lie too. And frankly, it feels like an even bigger lie than my liberal use of the word standing. Yet, whenever I walk by the mirror, this is what I see. Me, sitting, contained by a wheelchair, all nuts and bolts and metal and wires, and me just sort of dropped there, slightly stooped, still not standing at all. And so I go through the world knowing that I am rolling around encased in something other than my body. And that thing that I am encased in is to a large extent how I am seen and how I am defined by the world. I also know that hardly anyone ever gets to see me full length. They get to see me as you see me now, half length at best. Head up top, feet on the bottom, midsection, a kind of a mishmash in between the head and the feet. But the minute I roll away from the mirror, I am no longer that seated, stooped person who looks kind of strange, rolling about the world in such a seemingly unnatural way. In fact, the minute I roll away from the mirror, I feel strong and free and not encased at all. Like right now, for example, I feel my legs underneath me standing on this stage. I feel my arms kind of moving about, my hands sort of moving wildly. I talk with my arms and hands a lot. And it takes me a second to clue into the fact that this is happening in the context of a wheelchair. I forget about it a lot. And so I guess what it all comes down to is meaning. And so when I say I am standing, to me, I am, whether I'm here on the stage at TED or crossing the finish line of a race. And I'm up there and out there in the best way that I can be. And to pilfer a little bit from Gertrude Stein, a word is just a word is just a word. So when I say I walked somewhere, I did in my own way. It's just a question of interpretation with a dash of perception thrown in. And what it's not is a lifetime of delusional thinking or even a truth to be reconciled. It just is what it is, and I am what I am, and it turns out that both are enough. And that, again, is true for all of us. So on the days that I feel clear and connected, I can make a pretty clear choice about who I am, and it's someone who is bigger than a mirror or an expectation. In fact, on those days, I can recognize it's not really a choice. It's just who I am. It's who we all are, really. But on the days when I'm feeling frustrated, maybe I'm not able to do something in the way that is expected or the way that would seem normal or like how everybody else can do it, then I fall to an expectation that is so not who I am, how I live my life, or how I want to live. And it's a choice that I can change my mind on whenever I so choose. And again, that is true for all of us. I wanted to start my talk today about the words I use to describe my activities because the first reason is because of the theme of this TED series, which is the creative spark. And my realizing this disconnect between how I see myself and how I am seen by the world came to me really in the spark of an instant on one ordinary weekday night. And it was probably something years in the making, but the way it came to me, it might as well have been in a flash. It's suddenly struck me in a way that it never had before, that there is a huge disconnect between how we see ourselves and how we are seen by others. The second reason for my starting the talk about the language I use to describe my activities is because I want us to think about the language we use to describe ourselves and others. The images we create about ourselves and others, because those images then classify and shape what we view as the truth. Those things, rightly or wrongly, come to define us more than we define ourselves. And what we need to think about is how we create ourselves, particularly through language. We need to consider the fullness of words, but also their emptiness. Because if language is going to be one of the chief negotiators in our creative process, we need to be mindful of the language that we are using in that process. We need to be mindful of what words are and what they are not, about how others define us, but more importantly, about how we define and create ourselves. And we need to do this in order for that gap, in order for that disconnect to no longer really matter. There's a great quote from the researcher Dina Georgis, where she says that shame activates what matters. And so if our sense of womanhood, of manhood, of intelligence, of ability, of disability, whatever it may be, if that matters to us, then any words that incite feelings of shame, that incite feelings of vulnerability, will activate that deep-seated shame, that deep-seated feeling of unworthiness. So words can either play to our strengths or they can feed into our perceived weaknesses. Words will do whatever it is that we allow them to do. And while I'm talking largely about disability today, as I've already sort of touched on, this idea can apply, this fragmentation between ourselves and how we are seen by the world, this can apply to many areas of life. Again, it can apply to whether we describe ourselves as a woman or as a man, how we think about our sexuality, if someone is homeless, the list can go on and on. But to go back to disability, which is the central focus of my talk today, and some of the words I've used to describe it, including helpless, wheelchair, encased, dependent, and of course, the word disability itself. If we think about those words, if we look at those words, they in and of themselves are neutral, as all words are. If we take away the images that have come to be associated with those particular words, they themselves mean next to nothing. But when you think about other words I used, like stooped and odd-looking, those words are also neutral, but they conjure up all kinds of frightening and pathetic images about what it means to be a person with a disability, trying to have any kind of life or be any kind of person in the world. So again, words themselves at their core are like Jell-O or marshmallows. They're largely harmless and innocuous. but it's the images that they have come to be associated with in terms of what it means to be disabled, or again, what it means to be a woman, or when we're talking about someone's sexuality. It's the images that those words have come to be associated with. And if it's any topic that makes us feel in any way vulnerable, it is then that those words and their subsequent images become loaded and shame-activating missiles. They're extremely powerful. I want to leave you today with another great quote, or what I think is a great quote, from politician Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who said that everyone is entitled to his own opinion, but not his own facts. And I love that quote because so much of what we take about in terms of facts about ourselves or others are instead acts of pure creation. They're not facts. And we will use whatever tools we have available to us to create. Tools including art, including music, including science, and language. But unfortunately, very often we create with very little thought as to what we are creating and the harm that we may be doing to ourselves and others. But at the end of the day, and here comes Gertrude again, a word is just a word is just a word. And while we need to be mindful of the words that we use, we need to be even more mindful of the images that those words are associated with, the things that those words evoke. Because the words unto themselves are quite empty, but words beget other words. And if what we are choosing to speak, or if what we are choosing to hear about ourselves are words associated with shame, as opposed to being associated with power or truth, then we need to engage in a whole new creative process. And we need to change what we say so then we can change how we think, and we can then change how we are in the world. And so that ultimately we can change how we see ourselves and how we see other people. Thank you so much.